Thanks for joining me. I'm Mark Richman. This is Security 101. Before I start, I want to be really clear. Beginner's track, 101 in the title. If you already know basic FileMaker Security and you implement it regularly, then go to another session. Go to a session and learn something new. The goal here is to provide basic information for folks who are not necessarily confident that their solutions are as secure as they should be at the most simple levels, and to kind of give you some lessons and ideas about how to maybe start to adopt those new habits, and then to leave plenty of time at the end for questions. I myself am not a security expert. I'm a security intermediate. I'm more of an engineer and a data modeling and a performance guy. But this is the kind of stuff that can really make or break your day, ruin your week, your month, your year. And so I felt like it was an important topic. It's something that's important to me and my development team. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in. We do have a microphone, and we should have plenty of time at the end. I'm going to try to keep the pace going. I'll stop for questions along the way, but we have a short time, so let's just go ahead and dive right in. So who am I? I was originally born in New York. Am I hitting a button here? Born in New York and raised there in 1968. Moved to St. Louis back about 20-something years ago. Kind of accidentally started two companies, Skeleton Key and Bright Source IT. One of them is the application development company you may know of here in the FileMaker community. The other is the sister company that does managed services and IT support. My own background is sort of in security and a little bit of Cisco engineering and firewalls. That was sort of what I was doing before I really got heavily into FileMaker. And then so I was kind of a casual hacker. I like to try to break things and get into things. I also do a lot of sales and engineering for Skeleton Key, which means I'm often the first person who sees an existing system if we're inheriting a legacy system from another developer, an in-house user, which means I'm the one who's trying to figure out how to open the thing because of all the reasons I'm going to explain now, because of lack of security. I'm also a typo finder, and that's probably the most relevant item on this slide, and that's to say I've found typos in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Wired Magazine, The Economist, you name it. Other than National Geographic, I think I've found it in everything I've ever read. And that's because there's humans who proof those articles and write those articles. Humans make mistakes. And that's my main theme today, is that we're all human. No one here is a robot. Robots are programmed by humans. Mistakes are everywhere. So we need to make sure we cover the basics and cover them all the time. Because every one of these pieces of advice has got a story behind it. I'm going to try not to get into the stories because of time. But let's keep going. The other thing to know is that I'm also the father of 4 boys. So I've come to believe that prevention is the best medicine. I also have 2 dogs, and I'm kind of like, if you just make it so they can't do it, they won't do it. Just expecting that people will follow the rules isn't necessarily mean they're going to follow the rules. We all know this about our passwords, right? The FileMaker built-in password tools are not necessarily about complexity. You can say, change the password every 90 days. But unless you're using something like Open Directory or Active Directory or OAuth to some other kind of complex tool somewhere, the ability to kind of force them to use numbers and letters and other kinds of things in there, is somewhat limited. That's not a feature that's currently available, that kind of tool. So same thing is true here. I do my best to try to think ahead. What will the users do? What are the mistakes that can happen? What are the worst case scenarios? And then put in simple safeguards to prevent that from happening. So I do have formal objectives for today. They're loosely going to fall into several categories, like why security matters, just to make sure we're all on the same page. What are some of the common pitfalls that you're going to run into? What are the relevant features in different pieces of the platform, like Pro, Advanced, and Server that you could use? Not all of them, just my favorites, the ones I think are going to make the biggest impact quickly. And then finally, some of the best practices, like how I think those things could be configured. Again, we don't have a lot of time to do a lot of demos, so I've got screenshots of the different areas with nice big coaching marks on them, and certainly happy to follow up afterwards. The one thing I'll say I haven't done, and I intend to do, in addition to uploading these slides, is to take all these best practices and put them into a 1-page PDF and put it up there with actual checkboxes on it. So if you want to, you can just use it as a checklist. It certainly won't be the worst checklist or the best checklist you've ever had, but it would be a checklist to get you started. But really, I'm going to kind of take, and avoiding mistakes, sorry. How do you avoid some of these mistakes in the first place? Just some of these other kind of best practices that I think are worth mentioning. But I want to kind of follow what Andy did in the opening session, which is just be really clear and just say what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to avoid this from happening to you, okay? Nobody needs a black eye. You don't need to have to deal with the time you lose, the money you lose, and your reputation, which is probably the most valuable thing any of you have, whether it's in-house as a developer or inside of a community like this or inside of a particular industry where you have expertise. One data breach one loss of data, one lost solution, that could be it. You could lose a lot of money, depending on your insurance. You could lose your clients. You could lose future clients, referrals, and so on. So you don't want to look like that guy. All right, so why does security matter? So the eggs in the basket thing is kind of obvious. We're putting all of our data into systems these days where we're kind of exposing ourselves to a different kind of risk. There's a little bit of pleasure in all the pieces of paper around the office because the odds of you losing all of them are very slim. But more and more, our information that runs our business is mission critical. Without it, we wouldn't be able to actually operate. And we've made it easier for people to find it and manage it, but now it's all in one place. So we're kind of starting to centralize this data because we're turning it from paper, where it's spread across desks and file cabinets, and we're putting it inside storage systems. And we're often doing that in a way that's a single file or on a single server. We're also moving a lot of stuff to the cloud. And so as we're using FileMaker Cloud or Amazon or any other kinds of services, Dropbox, Box, whatever, we're starting to put things all together in one place because that's where they seem they should be. If we're normalizing all of our distributed data, we're starting to make a single data model that controls it and contains it, and we're starting to expose ourselves to greater productivity and efficiency, but also more of a single point of failure. The fact that it's in the cloud and it's virtualized storage and it's kind of spread everywhere, that doesn't mean that thing can't fail. I mean, everybody read the news several months ago when Amazon Web Services storage went down for a while. That can happen. There's a human behind that. I don't really need to say much more about that. The other is that there's all these security protocols out there. There's all these best practices. Everybody knows about it, and nobody really adopts them. Not at least quickly. I don't know. It's literally been less than 24 hours since I spied someone with a sticky note on their monitor with the password. And we all know that's not a good idea. I know lots of people who are still using 1, 2, 3, 4 on their phones to get in and haven't adopted Touch ID. Or my kids know the code that we use on the safe in the hotel room. Why do my kids know the code to the safe? Because they watched us type it in and we didn't protect ourselves. So this is something that's going to also continue to plague us. But probably the biggest reason that security matters, especially in the FileMaker space, is that if I had $50 in a copy of your database, I could break it open. And I've done that. In my job as a sales engineer, as people come to me with their databases, 20% of the time, they don't know the password because that developer died, or they left, it's disgruntled, or they never got it, or they wrote it down and they lost it, or they don't remember it, or they never thought they needed it, or it was something really easy, but it was like 20 years ago. Whatever their reason is, or maybe 8 of the files they have the password, and 2 of them they don't. But that means I can't really get under the hood to look at what they've got to understand it. So what do? I buy Passware or some other kind of hacking software, and it just scalpel surgically removes the passwords from my FileMaker file and lets me log in. Now, that file's corrupted. I wouldn't use it, but I can still get to the data. And once in a while, that's a real lifesaver, but it doesn't solve my problem of wanting to modify that solution, extend it, enhance it. It just lets me get to the raw data, assuming it works. It doesn't always work on every file. And we'll talk about a feature in particular that would even foil that. But I've done this no less than 10 times in the last 10 years with permission when clients have brought me things that they needed to get into and they just needed a salvage operation. Last case scenario. So FileMaker Security is great, but every database, except when you get into encryption, almost all of them have some way that they can just be cracked open. The same software that does this does it for 20 other database platforms. $50. It's good software, though. I'd buy it if you ever have that kind of situation. So we can't control everything. I'm kind of a big fan of a quote, a little snippet of a quote that, what is it? Life breaks free. Anyone here seen Jurassic Park? Ian Malcolm, Jeff Goldblum's character. I really like his character. I really like him as an actor. But this quote always really kind of resonated with me. It's a much bigger quote, but the main point is that we can try to put up the guardrails and the frameworks and all the things we think are going to stop things like my kids, my dogs, or crazy dinosaurs. But regardless, somehow or other, life will find a way. And I think the same is true to a certain degree. Your users, hackers, IT people, electricians, cleaning people who come in at night and don't realize what they're doing, plugging their housekeeping equipment and stuff into the server rack. All these things have happened. If they haven't happened to you, I promise you they happened to someone in this room, and a lot of them have happened to me in our IT business. And somehow it always happens. So if I can put at least some basic safeguards in place, some of which are at a distance, I can at least protect myself from all these things I can't control. The other problem is that it's really not these other people that are the really biggest risk. The really biggest risk is us. We are the ones who make the biggest mistakes. I've got a very senior member of my team, another speaker at this conference, who is super smart and super sharp. He built a little test file. He was testing something. He put encryption at rest in. He hosted it on his FileMaker server. He typed the password for the encryption key into Safari. Everything was going great. He needed to do some reboots and software updates, and it asked him for the encryption password again. And he didn't write it down, and he couldn't remember it. And Safari didn't remember it, and now he lost that 2 hours or 3 hours he spent building that test file. Of all the people I would have thought would have never done that, it was him. But he did it. Now, granted, it wasn't for a client system. He wasn't doing billable work, but it's his 2 or 3 hours that he lost. That's still valuable. So if you value your time, you value your client's money, you value your employer's money, and you value your data, these tips are hopefully going to help you realize that you are probably the biggest risk in the system. Then your users and all these other third-party actors. My goal is to protect you from yourself. So people are kind of unpredictable. And in addition to being unpredictable, they tend to pass that downstream. So my guess is that if you've learned any security protocols or best practices, you've learned them by observing those who taught you or around you, if they had any. And the other thing to think about is that if you don't adopt any kind of protocols to this thing, you're going to pass it down to whoever you're training and mentoring now. So this is my wife, Sally, who's a bit unpredictable. If any of you have met her, seen her around DevCon. This is my youngest son, Clark. You can tell by his smile, he kind of is like Sally. And I can see it every day. I mean, just even in something this simple, like the words that come out of his mouth are literally the expressions that come out of her mouth. And out of his mouth, they're really cute, but they're kind of dangerous. And the same is going to be true of your junior developers. You delegate something to someone, you're focused on schema, you're focused on layouts and workflow and use case and design. And if you don't cover security first or really early, that person's going to build a beautiful system that, in the long run, causes more pain than it does happiness. So common pitfalls. Things to watch out for. I'm not going to get into all of these in depth because some of these are just straightforward, but they will be on the checklist, and I'll circle back on some of them. Lackluster locks, locking up your server, locking up your backup drive. Physical security is still the #1 issue. Would anyone here actually leave their hotel room to come down here and leave their room open? Anyone? But we do that all the time. I walk into clients, the security room on the server room, the door's open. It's hot in there, we propped it open. You know, or the backup drives are just sitting out there right on the shelf. They're not physically secured in any way. Or someone takes them and they take them out and they put them on their desk and then they go to lunch. We have a small collection of glassware at my house, of really cool glassware from cool restaurants, that has somehow made it from the restaurants to our house, all right? Because my wife likes glassware. And that's because there's, you know, it's just so easy. All this stuff is so easy to just take. That whole $50 and a backup, the reason I was able to do that in some of those cases were because people were able to give me a backup file that they got somehow through some scheme from the developer who was otherwise holding that file hostage. They told them it was for business continuity or that they had to do some kind of, you know, thing with their lawyer or whatever it was, and then they gave it to me so I could crack it open. So where there's a will, there's a way, and that stuff's going to happen. Bad passwords. Like I said before, FileMaker doesn't force you to have good ones, just to have them sometimes. And so unless you're using tools to generate them and keep them random and not easy to guess, odds are you're setting yourself up for something that's just easy to hack in, like a phishing scam, just by guessing, brute force kinds of methods. The other, of course, is not securing those passwords, putting them somewhere else, physically in a book, in a safe somewhere that's fireproof, or using LastPass or some other kind of third-party tool of some kind to store them elsewhere, not where the database is. Putting your passwords in a FileMaker database on the same server as your FileMaker database is, or in the same server room as the server, is just a recipe for one big problem when you lose the whole room to fire, water, theft, or something else. Bad backups. I hope this is a high number of hands. Who here has backups of their database server? Okay, keep your hand up if you have a backup of your database server. Keep your hand up if you've tested your backups within the last 30 days, meaning you've opened up a backup file that you backed up specifically to test it. So a lot of hands went down, about half of them. It's one thing to have your backups configured, have them set up correctly, going to the right drives, et cetera, secured and physically and so on. It's another thing to actually open them up and see if they're any good. We had this problem at my own company less than a year ago where I needed to go back a week, and when I went, the Datto, real expensive backup system we have, wasn't configured to back up the right folder. And so all I had was 7 days of backup, 6 months of assuming we had good backups that weren't on the Datto. So I looked at my partner who should know better, and I was like, you know, cobbler's shoes, everyone's heard that one, right? didn't take care of our own stuff because it was just a blind spot. We thought it was done properly, we didn't test it, and we didn't have a testing regimen in place for our own stuff. It happens. And tepid testing. You can also tell I like alliteration. Testing, I don't mean just, and we'll talk about this, I don't mean just testing your backups. I also mean testing your development. At the end, I'll talk a little bit about the fact that this is mostly about security from an administrator or security perspective as a developer, kind of making sure you put the right protection around your system. But there's also another component of that, which is making sure that the actual stuff you're developing, the data itself, the workflows and all that stuff, are actually keeping that data safe as well. That people aren't trampling all over it, that you're able to do some kind of traceability to figure out what happened and when to that data. Because it's one thing to get in securely, it's another thing to find that the data is just a jumbled mess when you get in there. In which case, I don't know, it's like locking the fox inside with the hens. It's a secure building, but there's a slaughter going on inside. And then forgotten features. So we're going to spend a lot of our time on this. Most of my slides are about these features. It's just kind of walking you through Pro Advanced, and Server, and pointing you to the most important features, many of which I think many of you will know, but maybe you're just not using or not consistently using and don't have a process for making sure you use them. So let's dive into that. So we're going to start with relevant features. I said relevant for a while. It said most relevant. People can debate this. I just chose the ones I thought are going to make the biggest impact, but there's tons of security features I don't even mention today. So let's go ahead and get into these. First of all, there's the default accounts. You've got the full access admin account. You've got the guest account. We're going to talk a little bit about those. You've got file options where the login using setting is enabled to kind of make it easy. You guys might remember, that Rick Coleman mentioned at the opening session that, FileMaker's kind of got this struggle between making it secure by default and making it easy for first-time users. So we all know when we make a new file, up comes that file ready for you to develop. And that's because the default accounts and the file options are making it easy for you to get in with all the privileges of a super developer. That's awesome on day 1. It's not so awesome on day 31. And somewhere between day 1 and 31, it should be secured. And a lot of that has to do with how valuable the data is you're putting into it, or the effort you're putting into it, or how proprietary the processes are, and so on. There's the question of file access. This is my database. Most of our solutions, unless you're a separation model person, are just a single file. Everything's inside that one file. Occasionally we have 2 files with a separation model, and then as we get into mobile and web, we sometimes start to differentiate for performance or other reasons, having several satellite files around our main file. Well, file access is a feature that was added several years ago, and it's one that can kind of just lock the door right off the bat and say, unless you have a key card, you're not getting in here. And most of the time, nobody needs a key card because that file is a standalone solution. So we'll look at that as well. And then finally, extended privileges. Extended privileges we tend to think of as like FM app, FM PHP, the various ways that people can get into our solution. We don't necessarily think of them in terms of letting someone come in after a period of idle. So we're going to talk about FM reauthenticate and why I would argue that it's an important one to think about whether it should be left at its default setting or not. The other ones kind of lend themselves to the pathways people use to get to your system, not once they're in, whether they can sit around for a while and then just get back in. Someone puts their phone down, someone else picks their phone up. Who knows if that phone's secure, but there's your database. So there's a vector there for someone to get in whether they intend to or not. So first picture, edit account. So that's the part you need to worry about. Admin passwords, there is no such thing until you give it one. Every FileMaker file when it's born has an admin account. It's a full access account. It has no password. If you didn't know that, now you do. It's right there in the help. It's kind of not so obvious when you launch the file. But people come to us often, strangely enough, built this file, it's really great, and this file is literally hosted with full access, and everybody in the company is using full access. Not only do they not know who's making changes to which records, but everybody can go into layout mode if they want to and delete the layouts. They could go into the schema and change the schema and add new fields because the developer just didn't know. They were just like, it was magic. I opened up the file, I did my development, I hosted it, everyone could use it. No one had to log in. It was just, I thought it was secure. So first thing you should do, in my opinion, is go and set this with a password. Doesn't have to be something fancy. It could just be something simple. And that'll immediately run you into the next thing, which is the file options for login using. So the last slide and this slide together are what make that happen when you launch a FileMaker file. The first time when you create that new record, create that new file, it lands on your desktop and opens up. Whether it's a starter solution or a brand new blank file, it's got those two settings, no password on the admin, and admin is the default user, bang, open the file and let people in and do their thing. So my first step when I make a new file is set an admin password and go and disable this. In fact, there are very niche examples of when you would ever use this. There's some situations where you have anonymous users on mobile devices using pins or web users. I don't know. There's some esoteric situations where it's necessary to have files auto-log in so that some other way of authenticating people can play. But your norm is going to be users have their own accounts, they have their own passwords, whether those are stored in the FileMaker system, whether they're stored outside. And so having this enabled is almost a never in my experience. And I've been developing in FileMaker for 25 years now, or 23 years, a long time. And I can think of like 2 systems where this was ever checked on, except for the day one when I created the new ones. File access came around, I think it was in either 11 or 12. It was 11, which surprised me. I thought it was 12. This was actually to plug a security hole. I believe that was found by a member of our community. It might have even been Stephen. You might have been the guy who pointed this out, Stephen Blackwell. And that is that even if you didn't have full access to a file, you used to be able to take your file and point it at someone else's file, and using your credentials into that file, still access elements of the schema. You wouldn't necessarily be able to override your normal security settings to do things like manipulate the data, but you might be able to access and see things about the schema. You might be able to read data that you otherwise had no way to get to because there was no layout that expressed it for you. So it was a real risk that you could have this like, it'd almost be like a connector in the hotel room, where like your room is really secure, you got the front door locked, everything's great, and you walk out, and then someone goes into the room next door and comes right in with one of those connector doors. And so this is a way to lock that connector door and say, It's off by default to make it easier for developers, right? This is that tension that Rick was talking about. You should be able to create a file, create another file, start connecting them together with relationships or separation model and not run into anything. And I would argue, since most of your solutions are standalone, come in and check this box. And from that point forward, if you want to bless another file to be allowed to exchange direct interactions with this file, you'll bless it. This doesn't keep you from exporting and importing. It keeps you from tapping into it as an external data source, manipulating scripts, value lists, all the other things you might share between files. There's an authorized feature down there. This is kind of a complicated feature, not to set up, but to understand the repercussions of it. So if you've never used it, this is one of those you're going to have to do a little reading. The last two, not so much. They're pretty straightforward. This one, a little bit of reading, like what happens when I clone my file? What happens when I want to give a copy of this file to start another file? Like, what's the authorized, deauthorized process? Is that inherited? Is it not inherited? I'm not going to try to educate everybody. I'm sure I'll get it wrong. But I'd say check that box, and then when you need to start getting 2-file solutions, 3-file solutions going, you come back in here and you read about the feature. It's not that hard, but it's something you need to learn if you don't do a lot of separation model or a lot of multi-file solutions. And the extended privileges. So, like I said, there's FMAP and FMODBC or XDBC. There's all these extended privileges for pathways into your solution. This is the one that's set by default to FM Reauthenticate 10. For a while, back when this first came out, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, was 12, and back then it was Go only, now it's Pro and Go. It had to do with how long could a user be not in that file, sleeping on their computer, hibernating, on their device, before they would be prompted to log back in. So we've all seen that message where the file comes up and says you want to reconnect or close the file when there's been sort of a slowness or a kind of a delay or a sleeping situation. It's kind of convenient. If this is set really high, I just get right back in. But like that scenario I talked about before where my phone isn't secure and I'm in my password database or not my password database, I'm in my recipe database or my project database, and I set my phone down and someone else picks up my phone, not even noticing, and they just hit the home button and it goes in because I don't have security in my phone, and then they realize they're looking at some database. If I had this set down to FM Reauthenticate 0, then the moment my phone went to sleep and someone tried to reconnect to that database, they'd be forced to re-log in and reauthenticate. It might be me, which could be really annoying. So you have to weigh this against workflow. You have to kind of think about, do I have someone who's going to be like going to a kiosk, putting it to sleep, and then going over here and doing inventory, and then coming back at every 3 minutes they're going to have to reauthenticate? That would be terrible. So what other options do I have? Can I maybe secure the machine or the device and let them stay logged in? There's choices. I can't, as a developer, control what people do with their phones or their Macs or their PCs. But I can control what happens with the solution. And that's my goal, is to control the solution, not the users or their devices that I can't control. So this is one of those I'm sure I get more debate on than any other point I've made so far, I guess, is setting this to 0, I think, is just another way to lock it down And then if workflow or use cases require it, you can have several of these. That's something else that's very unique about this extended privilege, is that you can make lots of extended privileges, but this is one where you can specifically recreate the same string, FM reauthenticate, and have 0 for some users and 10 for other users and 360 for other users. That's how many minutes before they are forced to reauthenticate when they sleep or hibernate. So we have solutions like that where I can stay in all day, but this end user can only be in there for 0 before they have to reauthenticate. It's not the same as idle on the server where the server kicks you off if you're familiar with that setting. This is specifically related to the user's device or machine slept or hibernated, and as a result, we're not sure if it's still them coming back to the file because it's not a continuous user experience. There's a couple features I debated including, which I'm going to throw out there, although these are a little bit, well, one of them is a little bit more esoteric. The other one I think is critical. In FileMaker Pro Advanced. So for those of you who've ever used FileMaker Pro Advanced, you have a white card that you got when you registered that came in your packet of stuff that will give you a free download for FileMaker Pro Advanced. So now you can use it. Some great tools in there. One of them is custom menus. My feeling is that there are some very powerful commands in the FileMaker menus that not all users should be allowed to use. I've got my 2 favorites I'll point out here in a minute. But understanding custom menus can allow you to remove those commands just to protect people from themselves, protect humans from humans for accidentally making a mistake. And the other is encryption at rest, which is a very powerful feature. And basically what it does is it makes sure that the contents of your FileMaker file, independent of your passwords going into the file, whether they're hosted on a server or sitting locally on your machine, that the contents of that are encrypted on the disk. This is a prerequisite if you're in the medical field or in financial services. You're not building a database unless you're using this. And in fact, there's going to be a session later today at 2:15 on FileMaker Security in the enterprise where they get a real deep dive into this topic. So I'd recommend that topic if you're more interested in all the good reasons for using encryption at rest. But I'm going to show you where that's set up. It can be another little thing you have to manage as you're kind of pulling copies off the server to work on them and uploading them on the server to put that value in the server, like that scenario I told you about with my colleague. But these are features I'd consider. They're not necessary in every situation. In some environments like enterprise and financial services and medical and such, absolutely essential that you use encryption at rest. And we'll take a look at screenshots of those now too. So custom menus are a little complicated to set up, and mostly because there's this standard FileMaker menu set, and if you want to create the same exact menu set with just one different menu, you got to build it yourself, which means you have to copy every menu, assemble them in the right order, and then make that the default for your file. So again, just like the file access, it's a worthy read, a little bit of experimentation in a new file is worth doing. I'm just going to show you what I was aiming for. I basically took the records menu, and I duplicated it, gave it a different name so I'd know it, and then I took out these 2 commands, which for me are delete all records. Any user with read-write access can use delete all records and delete every record in the table in the context that they're in. And there's nothing to stop them because they need to create records. Unless you've got a really complex logic in there with scripted deletes, odds are they're able to just create a record and delete a record. So what's to keep them from deleting all 35,000 records? That command and whether or not they hit the right button on the next dialog box that prompts up. The next most powerful one, in my opinion, is replace field contents. And that's because it can make a change across the found set in a particular field. So that's like batch editing. 35,000 records go from saying yes or no in a field to all saying yes, which could be really catastrophic for your data. So this kind of gets into the whole question of preserving your users from making dramatic mistakes. It's not, I would say, formal security, but in Security 101, I think these are lessons we've learned the hard way. I want you guys to never experience what I've experienced with these 2 features. I've actually experienced these 2 features, this one and that one, when I was working as a developer and I accidentally used those features when I was troubleshooting or migrating data. Oh, I'm fixing this, and I found that found set, and I did delete all records, and whoops, wrong found set, wrong window. And then boom, I had to go to a backup, and I lost the last X hours of work. And the same thing with replace field contents. I knew what I needed to change. I had the right calculation. I replaced it in the wrong found set and destroyed a bunch of data. So I had to go revert, spend all this time doing cleanup just to get back to where I was. So in order to use encryption at rest, you have to use the developer utility built into FileMaker Pro Advanced. I didn't show both dialogues. The first dialogue, you know, I'm obviously not showing you where all the menus are to get to these commands. Basically, the first thing you do is you add the file you want to modify, you add it, you say you want to set up the options, and then you select this option, which is Enable Database Encryption, which is sadly not called encryption at rest, but that's just a misalignment of the acronyms. You specify your shared ID. You have to authenticate that you actually are allowed to do it, put in an encryption password of some kind, and then it's going to encrypt that data at rest in the file. And moving forward, if you want to open that file on your machine to do development, or you want to host that file on a server so that it can be accessed by other people, you're going to have to provide that encryption password. Your users will not, to be clear. You're not creating an obstacle for them. They will log in with the same credentials, and the server will take care of the encryption at rest piece for them. But when you pull that copy down because you want to make changes for phase 2 of your project, you're going to have to provide it locally on your machine because that file's encrypted. My favorite part about this is that someone gets your backup drive, or they steal your server, or they grab that thumb drive that you left at the hotel that had a backup of your database on it, and they guess your password, or they buy that $50 piece of software, and it's pointless and useless because all the data is encrypted inside the file. So it's not like they open up the file and all the fields are scrambled. They literally can't open the file successfully even though they have credentials because it's an encrypted file and they don't have the encryption password. So the whole thing is hashed. It's just a jumble. Now, I've never really taken a FileMaker file that wasn't encrypted, maybe I did years ago, and opened it up with a text editor or ResEdit or one of these other tools out there. But you can do that, and you can see some recognizable data in it. This would make that impossible. It would be just completely gone. Yes? No, you do this as a developer, bless you, before you upload it to the server. In fact, that's a really great point. If you try to, like if you're using FileMaker Cloud and you try to upload a file that doesn't have a password on it, that has any account with no password, or doesn't have this feature enabled, you haven't actually done this locally while you're developing on your local machine, Amazon won't let you upload it because it wants every single file to have all accounts secured with a password. Doesn't care how secure the password is. It could be just password, but there's no blanks. And it wants this enabled, or it says, nope, it's not an encryption at rest file. We don't want it on our servers. So to be clear, you have the file locally. Yeah, if it's hosted now, you take it down, open it with FileMaker Pro Advanced. Well, you don't open with FileMaker Pro Advanced. You open up FileMaker Pro Advanced. You launch the developer utilities. You pick that file. You set up encryption at rest. You put it back on the server. And then the server, when you go to start the file, when you try to host the file, it will say, oh, what's the encryption password? You type in the encryption password, and you can tell it to store it, and it'll remember that. And it'll keep remembering it from that point forward. There are certain situations when you're rebooting the server or doing a software update to the server, I don't know exactly which ones they are, where it will prompt you again for the encryption password. But normal operations of the server, doing backups, pausing, those work just fine. The server remembers the password and does it. I think it's only when you're manually going in there and taking the file up or down that it says, oh, well, before you host this file again, what's that encryption password? Because without it, the server can't host it. And again, if you want to use FileMaker Cloud, this is a must-learn feature. It's not a hard feature, but it means now you not only have a full access password to keep track of, you have a shared ID and an encryption password to keep track of. So you now have a good system for keeping track of your passwords. You now have several of them you want to keep track of, because without that information, you might not be able to come in here and make changes to that solution and get in there with the right level of access that you need, or host it. So there's a bunch of relevant features for FileMaker Server. I'm going to try to breeze through these really quickly so I can hit my time mark and give us plenty of time for questions. There's email notifications, basically making sure you know what the heck is going on with your server when you're not looking at the server. Leveraging external authentication. Like I said, passwords in FileMaker can rotate, but they can't necessarily have certain degrees of complexity like other systems can support. There's a question of, what about the data in transit? Is my FileMaker Pro connection or my FileMaker Go connection secure? Is my WebDirect connection or my custom web publishing connection, are these secure connections? And can someone kind of watch that data move over the wire? Encryption at rest, keep in mind, is at rest. So it gets decrypted so it can be sent to me. So what's encrypting that tunnel as it's being sent to me? That's what this is about. You've got a file display filter. The idea here is that, okay, I know who you are. Now what am I allowed to even show you? There's 100 files on my server. What should I let you see? I want to know who you are first, then I can show you the 10 files that you actually can log into. And then something that seems almost silly, require password protected files. This is that feature that's on by default in FileMaker Cloud and can't be turned off. And this is a feature that is off by default on FileMaker Server, and I feel like should be on. And then finally, your backups. And I'm not going to show you how to schedule your backups or configure progressive backups. I'm going to talk about why it's really important to know where they are and understand how they work. Because, like I said, great to back it up, but if that backup doesn't get off that machine, it's just all your eggs in one basket. So, and then finally, access logging. I keep forgetting my last bullet. This, again, is one of those debatable things. A lot of people here probably have a session system in their database. You know, user logs in, it creates a record that this user logged in on this date, and it puts it in a table somewhere. But that can fail. That's, you scripted it, you created the schema, it's inside the database. You know, there could be logic in there that doesn't work, or record locking, I don't know. It could be done wrong. But access logging on the server is every time someone logs into a file, it makes a record of it. And if you can check that log periodically and notice that someone's logging in with your account at 2 in the morning and it wasn't you, you might identify an attempt or a breach before you'd ever get notified, because it wouldn't look like there was anything wrong there to anybody. It would look like you were logging in at 2 in the morning to do some work, as opposed to someone else was logging in when you were sleeping at 2 o'clock. So just to make sure I'm fair with Windows and Mac, some Windows screenshots. So in the general settings, looks like that's cutting off a little bit. In the general settings on the email notifications tab, there's 2 sections that you need to manage for email notifications. I will tell you right now, 80% of the servers, and that's not a statistically, scientifically backed number, it's just my gut, don't have this configured. So I walk up to a customer, I'm like doing my interview, I say, let's take a look at your server to see how it's configured. I know I'm going to see this and about 7 other things that are misconfigured, and it's almost always this. No SMTP settings, so there's no way for mail to even come off this server if it wanted to. And then even if it is configured, no one actually turned it on to send emails to anybody for any kinds of warnings or errors or other kinds of problems. So you've got to get those settings from someone in your IT group or yourself. That server could be out in the cloud. It could be local on your network. Obviously, if the network's down or the internet's down or the mail server's down, this could fail. But most of the time, that stuff will be up, so it'll be working. And then you come down here and you set it up for at least errors only. That'll be like your backup didn't run, or a file didn't close properly, or serious errors. It's not going to be someone typed their password wrong. That's a warning. So again, I don't have all the warnings and errors memorized. They're all documented in the FileMaker server documentation. If you do turn on warnings or errors, get ready for a tidal wave of emails, okay? Because you're going to get warned every time someone disconnects because they went idle, or they couldn't be found because their laptop got closed and walked away, and every time someone types their password in wrong, you're just going to get emails, emails, emails all day long. There could be value in that if you had some kind of robot checking those emails, looking for kinds of, hey, there's a pattern there. 10 attempts to log in within a 5-minute period by a user, someone's trying to breach someone else's password. Or Julia logged in on Tuesday, but Julia's on vacation. So if I had a way to just say everybody who logged in on Tuesday, I could reconcile that against, you know, employee staffing or timesheets or time cards. I don't know if these are relevant situations. I'm just kind of throwing out the kind of areas where that might be useful. For me, I just configure SMTP, set it for errors only, test it, and then at least know that someone will be aware if a backup doesn't run. That's the main reason that I use this feature. Most of the settings are on the Database Server Security tab. Almost all the remaining ones except for the backups are going to show up here in logging. So this is so big I couldn't even scroll. So at the top we have FileMaker accounts and external accounts. So if you're using Active Directory or Open Directory and the server that you're on is bound to that domain, then you're going to get all the security groups out there available, and all those accounts and passwords will work. So basically, if I'm already logging into mail, and I'm logging into VPN, and I'm logging into my computer, and I'm using a username and password, you could put that person into a security group in your Active Directory, put that group into your FileMaker files, an external account, turn on this feature, as long as the server's on the same domain, and bang, that username and password will work. That's awesome if you're trying to make sure that when someone gets hired, they're given access to the databases they need, and when they get terminated or leave, they immediately get cut off from all the databases they no longer need. There are stories out there of we shut off their mail and their VPN and their whatever, but guess what? Someone could still use their login to log into a database. Joe quit 10 months ago. Why is someone still logging in as Joe? Because it was a local account. It wasn't an Active Directory. We killed his Active Directory. No one killed the local account. This happens a lot when databases are born inside departments and they're kind of hidden from IT, and then they have like freelancers and employees who were there 12 years ago who are still in the local account list because no one was using centralized. Now you've got Amazon, Google, and Microsoft OAuth support, so you can even delegate that further. Of all those, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Microsoft is the one that uses groups, so it's the most similar to the way we're used to it working. The others are more name-based. But still the idea here is that you're delegating it to outside source because it'll be centralized, it'll follow IT standards, and the passwords can be much stronger, and enforced to be stronger. Plus, user changes their password in mail, changes it here too. So it's like, you have a 90-day rotation policy, it changes everywhere in the entire company all at one time. The file display filter, once you authenticate who a person is, tells them what files they should see. We have seen clients where they have 5 FileMaker servers, which is great for FileMaker licensing, but not so great for that client, because now they got 5 servers and 5 licenses and 5 things to back up, which means they're going to have more risk. And they did that because they wanted to put the accounting files on one server, and they wanted to put the manager files on another server, and they wanted to put the production files on another server, and so on, as opposed to putting them all in one server and using file display to prevent users from seeing that there was a salary database out there, or a performance review database out there, or a project database out there that has nothing to do with their job function. You combine these features, who is this person, and what can they see, and they authenticate before they even get a list of files from the launch center. For this server, they authenticate, and bang, then it shows them the 3 files they're allowed to see out of the 100. One server. If they're going to buy 2 server licenses, that's awesome, great. One should be for development and sandbox, the other one should be for production. You shouldn't have to have, at most scales, separate servers by department just for security. That's security through obscurity, that's security by hiding Easter eggs in different places, hoping no one will find them all. It's not really using the features that are built into the platform that are specifically built for that. You scroll down and you see some additional features. SSL for database connections. You can turn this on now without ever understanding SSL. And I'll tell you right now, I don't understand how to install one of those certificates. And I passed the certification test. Okay? You don't have to get 100% to pass the certification test. So this is one of those areas I have lots of people in my company who understand how to do it. And it's getting easier all the time. You can turn that on, and it will work, but you'll get a warning from FileMaker that this is just for testing only. It's not for production use. You should go get your own certificate. You should put it in there. If you do that, you must put it on your calendar. This is another thing you have to do outside the system, like storing your passwords, to renew it. We have had, again, as a professional services company, set it all up, rock solid security, put it on the calendar. Whose calendar? And then you get a call from the client. That security icon is broken. It's no longer secure. What's going on? Our database has got like HIPAA compliant data in or something. Someone forgot to renew the certificate. Now we got to scramble, get the certificate, install it. It's a delay. It interrupts the users. So turn that on for testing, but don't think turning it on all by itself. You've got to learn how to use this feature. So just like some of the other things I mentioned, a little bit of study, but way easier than it used to be. And there's tons of companies out there that can help you do it. It doesn't take very long at all. Same thing with the HSTS. That's for the web connections from WebDirect, custom web publishing. It's what makes sure that the web communications, not the FileMaker protocol, not Go and Pro, which is what the first one is for, but web connections are also secured. That means that the data while it's transiting between the server and the clients will also be encrypted at all the time. This is independent from VPN, to be clear. You learn how to use those 2 features, and you don't have to burden your users with VPN. They can get to your databases if you put them right out there in the public, because the database will be encrypted at rest on the server. The server will have secure communications with the clients. VPN just adds overhead and latency and performance, slowdowns, whereas this stuff can allow it to perform natively at a much faster speed without that extra overhead. And then the host password protected database is only, like I said, kind of a silly thing. I think it should be on by default. It's off, and it's required on FileMaker Cloud. In fact, FileMaker Cloud is really requiring, whether you know or not, the secure connections as well. You have to provide a certificate to FileMaker Cloud. You have to manage that certificate and install it. If you don't, you can't host there either. So they require encrypted communications, encryption at rest, and password-protected databases. If they're requiring it there, shouldn't we require it on our own systems? You switch over to the Folders tab, which is just another tab over, and you've got the locations of the backups and the progressive backups. Again, I'm not going to spend any time going into how those backups are configured and set up. That's another session, another time. But it's important to know where they are. Whether they're in the right place or not doesn't matter to me really, whether they're in C or D or on the same volume as your regular files or on a separate attached volume, that's, again, another topic. But if you don't back up that folder with something else, like the data I mentioned, or CrashPlan Pro, or whatever it is that you're using, a batch file that runs on your server that copies them over to a hard drive, then these are just eggs in the same basket. You got to get them out of that basket and into another basket that's somewhere else. Ideally, somewhere halfway across the world, or at least not in the building or on the same block. Putting them into a hard drive that's attached to the server and then not taking that hard drive offsite every night is just a bigger basket, but it's still the same basket. A lot of people don't use progressive backups. They're very different than regular backups. Regular backups are a copy of your database, intervals, quantity. Progressive backups is sort of an in-between backup. Keeps overwriting the same one. Every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes. It's the gap filler. It's the between this backup at 1 and this backup at 2, what's making sure if I have a problem that I can retrieve data or revert. You got to learn how to use progressive backups, where they are, what do you do if you need them, how quickly you have to act. But I'd recommend learning about them. They're a really powerful feature. They're super fast, and they can fill the gaps. And if you have a large system and you're backing it up twice a day, you could have progressive backups running every 20 minutes, and you reduce the likelihood that you're going to lose more than 20 minutes of work, as long as you get notifications, can spring into action, and understand the feature so you're not fumbling around when the time comes. And then the last tab right after the folders tab is the logging tab. Access logging is off by default. Like I said, it writes a log file. It's got every login that was made to the files. You'd have to go to it and get it, open it with a spreadsheet or a text editor, or import it into a database and read it for it to have active value. But just knowing that it's being logged there is what I'm getting at there. So without it, you got nothing. If it's logging, it's just making little files. They take a long time to create 80 meg files, and then they just create a 001, 002 instance so they could just run and run and run and run. There are stories out there about log files that ran to infinity and filled the hard drive, but I'm not really super worried about that these days with storage, and this isn't one that grows very fast. Depends on your user population. But if you want to have some way to know, without having to program it into your FileMaker solutions, who's logging into which solutions when, that's where you do it. We often treat this as a free feature for HIPAA-compliant systems when they want to know access logging versus view logging versus edit logging. We just say, well, we're going to turn this on, and then we may also create access logging in the system like a session record, but this is our first line of defense on who logged into the system, because it's at the server level. Doesn't matter how good or bad our programming is, and then everything after that is sort of our responsibility. So we're going to talk about administrator mistakes. These are obviously developer mistakes too, but I wanted to classify the difference between the two. Actually, one of my kids did this the other day. Barely missed getting a rake in the face. There's a lesson moment. So lock the door. Some of these are things I've repeated, but I'm kind of going back to the top of my list from before. Lock the server room door. Secure the physical backup itself. If it's going off into the cloud, great, that's secure. As long as you verify that it's secure by downloading it and testing it. You should be able to download it, enter your encryption password, and make sure that the file's good and that the most recent records look like they were modified or created yesterday, whatever the usage pattern in your system is. You should generate secure passwords in the first place, or use some kind of external authentication that gives you the opportunity to force the users to do it, because they're doing it for some other reason on some other system. You should store those passwords, your local password. Your full access account is a local account. You always need one of those in a FileMaker file in order to be able to work on it when there's no server around. And so you got to secure that somewhere. I don't care if it's a book in a fire safe. I don't care if it's on the LastPass or a piece of software. I don't care if it's in a lockbox at a bank, but it's got to be somewhere else. I've even got a few that I've taken photos of, and then I've zipped them up and secured them on my phone. So like they're portable, they're with me, they're not in the cloud, they're not in the fire safe, they're always with me, but only I can get to them, and I know the password to open up. And I rarely do one place. I'll just put that out there too. Putting it like in the book in the fire safe is great unless the fire safe has a handle on it and someone can walk away with it. So I tend to kind of be excessively careful about, I know my full access passwords for my systems and they're stored in multiple places, and I know our encryption passwords are stored in multiple places, and the way someone else knows where they are. That's the other piece of that, so that if something happens to me, someone can get to them. And really what this comes down to is using checklists. We've all probably heard of the checklist manifesto and stories about emergency rooms that reduced infection rates by having simple checklists about doing IVs. And everyone who was offended, the doctors and nurses at all their training, that they needed a checklist on how to put an IV in. They learned that when they were a resident or pre-resident. The point is that once they finally convinced those doctors and those nurses to do that, infection rates dropped dramatically. So these people, once they realized, we're really good at it, but you tend to get lazy, or you tend to, I think I did that because I always did it. It was a habit. Well, guess what? We're human. We make mistakes. So I will create a checklist of the things I've talked about today, and I'll make sure I'll provide it for you. But then I'd say create your own. Have it, use it. One per solution, one per server. Make it a habit. And it also makes it easier, like any process, to hand it down to other people in your company or your organization when you go on vacation, when you have junior developers, and so on. So there are development mistakes. They don't fall into the kind of what your password is, not the greatest picture for this. And I figured it would be good to give you a few tips for me, really simple things that I think are worthwhile doing inside the solution to provide you a little bit of security as well. Just a couple of these. The first is reliable record serialization. Every record, in my opinion, in every single table in your solution should be serialized, even if it's like a dead end. It's silly to have a tagging system for categorizing a record and add IDs if that's stored in a related table. But there will be a day when you wish they were. So you can identify a pattern or a gap or something that happened when those records were created. Whether you use UUIDs or you use numbers, whatever works for your system, whatever makes sense. But they should be not empty, and they should be unique. So we always make sure we have primary keys. We always make sure they're not empty and unique, and then we set the number or UUID based on the case. Always recommend that every single table all the time. We saw a nice feature at the opening session that'll make that a little easier, but it's not that hard. Copy, paste, and Pro Advanced, pretty easy to do. Always include tracking fields. At a minimum, who created the record and when, who modified the record and when. And you can go all the way down that rabbit hole if you want. What machine were they on? What IP address were they on? What operating system were they using? What time of day was it on their machine or the server? Blah, 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 blah. You can track to your heart's content, but I always make sure we know every single table, primary key, who made it, when. We also, at least at Skeleton Key, never let anybody test their own stuff. So when we code something to preserve this precious data and present it for reporting and stuff, we make sure that we don't just give it to the customer and say, it works because I built it and I'm awesome. We make sure that some other developer who knows nothing about that system is given a test case, and they run the test case and they break it. I used to test the software. I break it all the time because I would do what I was told to do, and then I would go exploring. And I would find loopholes and breaks, and I would go in the wrong direction, in the wrong order, and I'd type in numbers to text fields and vice versa, and I'd see what the developer didn't think of. And so if you're developing by yourself, find a colleague, a spouse, an older child. The customer testing it, I promise you, customers don't test. They just don't really test. They're too impatient to get to your system. They don't test it. You give them a test plan. They say, yeah, I did it. Let's just go live. And the one person who doesn't will convince you that everybody does it, and they don't. So you got to write a test plan, and then you have to have someone else test it. And that's a skill to develop. It's really not one that comes naturally. It's so easy to develop in FileMaker and get something working really quickly. The more complex your systems go, the more important this becomes. The last piece of advice to avoid mistakes is to take all of this stuff really seriously. I know this is really simple, kind of straightforward stuff. A lot of it you've seen before or heard about before. Maybe you looked at it and said, I don't need it. I promise you, all of this comes from hard-won lessons that my team and I have experienced over 20-plus years of developing. At some point, you're going to get bit, and it's going to be bad. So now you're all officially FileMaker, Deputy FileMaker Security Officers, okay? You're going to go out there, and this is really important. One of the things that they mentioned at the opening session is that FileMaker is still FileMaker, but it needs some reputation building, right? People out there in the IT space and in the world don't necessarily know what this platform can do and how seriously powerful it is and how seriously secure it is. And the most likely reason they don't know that is because of people like us that have screwed it up along the way, because we didn't take it seriously enough to do it right, even the simple things. And then someone lost data, and that was the end of FileMaker at that organization, and that person told two friends, and they told two friends, and so on. If we can make sure that this stuff is buttoned down all the time, we'll start to build that reputation up, be an asset to FileMaker, and not a liability. Requisite resource slides, lots of historical information out there about 16, 15, 14, going all the way back through DevCon. I could have gone every year back. There's always been security sessions. But at least these years are all available for downloading or viewing or going to YouTube and watching. So again, I'm going to put these slides up right after this session, up on the PDF of these slides, up on the community site, so you should always be in there and you can get them. But these are all worthwhile sessions. They have lots of great stuff. This one, what would I find if I conducted an audit from Stephen Blackwell? He just kind of shows what a hacker can do. You get in there and you start looking for ways to crack open your systems. It's easy. You put these things we've talked about in place and it becomes a lot less easy and almost unlikely. And that's it. I'm going to put these slides up as is. The only update I'm going to put up there that's not in these slides, that has nothing to do with the session, is just a one-page PDF of the checklist. So that's all my stuff. Thank you, please, evaluations, and I'm happy to hang out for the time we have left to answer questions. I know this went a little longer, but I'm happy to hang around and make sure we're out of here in time for the next speaker. Thank you. If you have a question, I got a mic, or you can just raise your hand and belt it out, and I'll repeat it for the thing. Yes?
How do you know when your file is corrupt until you can't open it? Is there any early detection, how your file is corrupt?
So the question is, how would you know your file is corrupt before you couldn't open it? So there's a couple ways. There are some tools out there. I'm not even sure how many of them are current. Basically, the way I often find it out is I go to open a file, and right next to the file, a text file appears telling me that the file was closed improperly, which is a typical cause of corruption. And so it's just being aware of that file, that log that'll show up, and I don't remember what it's named, but it'll show up right next to the file in the same directory, and that's usually my first indication. The client gives me a file, I open it, I close the file and move. There's another document right there, and that tells me when I open it, file wasn't closed properly, I have potential corruption. Another place is you'll see it in FileMaker Server. When you take a file and you host it, if it wasn't closed properly, it'll prompt you and it'll throw an error. It may open it just fine, because sometimes they open when they're improperly closed but not yet so corrupt they won't open. So that's another early warning system. There are some tools like FMDiff and a few other file solutions out there. Maybe, I don't know if like Inspector or FM Perception, some of those tools out there have the ability to look at a file and check into some of the flags or settings inside the file to identify if it was closed properly every time or not. And I'm focusing on closed improperly because that is the single biggest source of corruption, where files are closed improperly by user. Basically, the application crashes. And so we kind of have a zero tolerance policy. Basically, we create a file and we take care of it for the entire life of that file. If I'm developing for 2 hours and my FileMaker Pro Advanced quits unexpectedly, I just lost 2 hours of development. I don't care how hard I worked. I go back to my last good backup. So it's really more about prevention. There's very little you can know about corruption until it happens, unless you're watching for those telltale signs. The big thing is prevention there. Don't work with files that were closed improperly that you were on your watch. Don't ignore those other signs. Yes? It's a great question that I don't know. The question is, we also have spontaneous quits. I don't think I've ever seen FileMaker, it doesn't throw the same kind of error message, right, where the app just quits. So I would technically guess the answer is yes, but I would want to run that past Clay or other members of the engineering team. You certainly wouldn't get a file, I think, about closed improperly on the device. That I don't think I've ever seen. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I just have a comment that may be of interest. We used CrashPlan for our offsite backup and it worked great for a couple of years, and then it just stopped working one day. And there's a problem with, so periodically CrashPlan goes back and cleans through old versions and so on, and something happened. They told us we can't use CrashPlan. I'm still trying to work it through it because it's the best service in my opinion.
Right.
Just something to be aware of.
So the comment and a little follow-up is that this attendee's had some trouble with CrashPlan Pro. It used to work, doesn't work so well. Could be the way it does things. There's something about the way FileMaker backups work where, for performance, they don't necessarily create actual files. There's a lot of what they call linking, right? So what that means is if I create a backup and it's creating another backup and another backup, and there's a file that hasn't really changed in the backup, it doesn't actually create a copy of that file. It creates a symlink in the operating system to the original file. It looks to you in the directory like it's the same file. It's got the same size that you would expect it to have and a date stamp, but really what it is a little alias or symlink, or a pointer to the original, which is why when you get into best practices about restoring is you never just take that file out. You copy and paste it somewhere so it actually is forced to create a new file that's an actual copy of wherever that path of symlinks goes. And my guess is that's somewhat related, is that it's seeing those as not real files, and so it's not backing them up the way it needs to. So you might need an intermediate tool there, some kind of local batch file that copies things where they need to go so they're actual files. And then back that up, correct. That's what I would probably try first. Yes, sir?
On the encryption, do you recommend waiting to do any encryption until the file is active and receiving data, or do you encrypt at the time you're developing?
We generally don't start encrypting the file just because of the pain of managing that and having to be prompted for it until we start to actually deploy it for testing with actual potential data or even testing data. So while it's under development and testing and actively going, we remove that barrier because there's nothing in there we're really worried about, and we've got good security around the intellectual property piece of that, just in terms of how we manage our data locally. But once we start to get it out to the wild, to the customer in testing, or have real data potentially typed in there like social security numbers and phone numbers and other things that we want to keep proprietary, then we start to use it. And usually it's when we use server. A lot of companies develop with server in the mix. We don't. We tend to do almost all our development locally and use version control. But I would avoid it until you have to and find that middle ground for you. Other questions? All right, I'll wait outside after I break my stuff down. I want to give the next speaker time. Thank you very much, everyone. Please do your evaluations. Have a great show.